Since the release of Rayquaza EX, I have done everything I can to put together the best deck possible, focusing on utilizing Rayquaza EX. And here's what I came up with. In this video, we're going to explore the possibilities for Rayquaza EX, why I chose the specific cards I did for this deck, why they work so well together, and we're even going to look at a match or two to see the deck in action. I tracked my games with this deck in high Ultra Ball at the start of the new season, and ended up with a surprisingly good 64% win rate. Let's start this video by jumping into one of those matches that I won that beautifully showcases exactly why this deck actually has the potential to be good, I think. The key idea with this deck is as follows. You're going to have one Pokemon up front who's kind of your meat shield, your blocker, soaking up, absorbing damage. You're going to put a tool on it, a helmet or a poison barb, and then you're going to start building up for example, one Rayquaza EX and one Giratina on the bench. And the reason why I think Rayquaza goes so well together in this particular package is because Snorlax, if you watch my past videos, by the way, if you're interested in ranked matches, higher ranks, tournament play, check out my other videos and please consider subscribing to the channel. I've talked at least once or twice this season about how Snorlax is popping up and seems like it may be really strong in this meta. It's a great wall, and with Barry, you're actually seeing it topping tournaments. Again, check out my past videos. Here in this match, we're up against Litten. They're probably going to try to be evolving it up into an Incineroar with a rare candy. But we've got our exact perfect setup that we want with this deck. We've got a Snorlax up front. It's acting as our wall. It's got a barb on it. We've got a second Snorlax that we went ahead and put in play to protect us from the Sabrina, and we're building up the Giratina, and we would be potentially building up the Rayquaza, but because of how the specifics of this match worked out, I decided to just focus on the Giratina. That way, this turn, if I needed to, I could actually bounce the Snorlax back to my hand and go ahead and get that first hit with the Giratina. So that was why I chose to start building it first. But now that everything's fully built, we can go ahead and start shifting around to building up other things. The reason why I think this is the best overall package for Rayquaza EX is because of Ilma. I feel like in most decks that you play Rayquaza, it's always gonna be hard to justify its inclusion versus some other Pokemon. Even in a Psychic deck like this deck, maybe a Mewtwo would be better, for example, Mewtwo EX. But because of the Ilma, it sets up these situations where if you play this Snorlax Giratina package and the Rayquaza, when you have the Ilma, it allows you to block in the front with Snorlax or Rayquaza. So you have a lot of different options. Again, here in this match, we started with the Snorlax up front, but if you happen to have a hand where the Rayquaza EX started up front, it can just go ahead and be your wall. It can soak up pretty much any attack, most attacks, and then you can Ilma it back to your hand while you're building up, for example, a Snorlax and a Giratina on your bench. Maybe you do a Barry with a Snorlax, and then Giratina also is going to come in. You Ilma back the Rayquaza up front, who is your blocker. And so this deck actually ends up having a ton of different possible ways that the games can play out, different ways that you block the original damage, use the Ilma to prevent your opponent getting any prizes, and you're almost always going to have some stuff built up on your bench. If you don't get any Giratina, it can probably be a little hard to win, but even then I've won matches just off of Snorlaxes, for example. This match also perfectly showcases how Rayquaza EX actually did pretty good here, because with this deck, you're going to be building up, doing exactly again what's happening in this match, building everything up on your bench with these walls out front, and my opponent, because they realize that, they're kind of stuck in this situation where they're just putting the Snorlax up front, and this has happened in multiple matches I've played with this deck, where the opponent is also going to have to start a more passive approach, because they also are going to go ahead and throw their shield up front, and they're going to be building up their bench. When that happens, you're going to have this additional option to use the Rayquaza EX to suddenly bring it out front and then start sniping away their benched Pokemon. Now, in this particular match, there may have been some luck with them stumbling a little bit on the Incineroar. I really couldn't tell by the end of the match. I wasn't sure if they were just holding back the Incineroar because they didn't want to lose the two prizes or not, because I'm sitting there again sniping with this Rayquaza EX. And right here, you're going to see it. Here it is. There's the power of the Rayquaza EX, finishing off two more Pokemon in one shot, and boom, with that, we win the match. And I think this is about as much fun as you can have with Rayquaza EX. And I'm going to go ahead and throw down the gauntlet. I'm going to put the challenge out there. Does anyone think there is a better actual Rayquaza EX deck out there? Not just a deck that is able to use Rayquaza EX better, like get it to use its attack quicker. I'm talking about overall win rate and the fact that this Rayquaza EX here in this slot might actually work in that slot as opposed to, for example, a Mewtwo EX. Again, in most Rayquaza EX decks, I think you could just change the Rayquaza EX into a different Pokemon to make it better, but I feel like in this deck, you can't actually. And I believe the only type of deck right now to set up this situation where Rayquaza EX is sort of the best in slot is to pair it with the Snorlax that has been doing very well recently, and then pair that up with an Ilma also. That way you have this setup I was talking about where you have this double dual wall action, put a few tools in there, poison barbs, rocky helmets, things like that, to then make them effective walls, and you now have a bunch of different options. And you're gonna need something to power in energies extra because you have to somehow build up Rayquaza EX or the Snorlax, and at least I would say one more Pokemon that you need to be building. I think the only two real choices here are going to be Magnezone, that had its free energy buildup done by the Magneton, but I think this is kind of just going to be a little bit too cramped in the deck. It's a little bit too much because you have to run all three forms of it. So I think the best way really is the Giratina EX here, which again, big surprise, it's also another card that's just doing great in general for a long time now. I think I'll keep this video short and sweet and end it by just really quickly going through, for those that are serious about this deck, really interested in it, going through the final couple cards in the deck and just giving a quick commentary on each one and my thoughts of what you might change and things that you might fiddle with. Okay, so starting at the top left, we've got the 3 Pokemon. I've talked about those at length. We've got the 3 tools, 2 Rocky Helmet, and 1 Poison Barb. These are, as I mentioned, for putting it on whichever Pokemon is going to be your wall at the start of the match, maybe even a Rayquaza that you're just leaving sitting there, you're not powering it up, you're just using it as in a wall. It pairs well with the Ilma. I think that probably 2 Poison Barbs are going to end up being better because what's going to happen a lot of the time is you're going to Ilma the Pokemon back to your hand, and so with the Poison Barb, you can just still keep getting that damage. I think that's going to make the deck a little better, but this was the version that I did use for all my matches. But if I keep playing it, I think I will make that change, or even possibly contemplate going up to a full 2 helmets and 2 barbs. Giant Cape is another card I could consider in the tool slot, maybe 1 Giant Cape, because right now, for example, with Rampardos is running around, it would be good on the Snorlax and the Rayquaza EX both. Sometimes they run a red. Depending on the meta, you might also consider Giant Cape. I personally think the deck needs at least 1 leaf. I just made a video of a Darkrai, Farfetch'd, Rotom, or Kangaskhan deck, and it had to have 2 leaf, and it played out pretty similarly to this deck where I always wanted to have 1 specific Pokemon up front. And the problem here is you almost always want to have 1 Giratina back on the bench. So if you, in those matches, which are going to happen a fair amount of time, where you do end up with the Giratina out front, it's like the worst start you can have. Having that 1 leaf is going to be very helpful. You could even potentially consider 2, although because of the way this deck works, you could even, some matches, you're going to leave that Giratina out front just soaking up damage as your wall in some crazy matches. The 2 Dawn here, I put these in. I love Dawn. I think it's super fun, and if you want to just have fun, just put the 2 Dawn in there. You can start with your Rayquaza up front or in the back. You're going to be getting those free energies with the Giratina, and then you can suddenly come in, surprise your opponent with that Dawn, getting that early Draco Meteor. Or even if you start with a Snorlax, get it up to 2 energy, use a Berry, and then again use the Dawn to get it to 4 energy from the Giratina, and once again surprise your opponent. It's just a really fun card. It actually seems pretty strong in this deck. Is it the best card? Not sure, but those are my thoughts on it. All right, and the final remaining 8 cards of the deck are all just absolutely essential, I think. 4 Berry, I'm pretty sure 4 Ilma is right. 4 Berry, obviously, you got to play with the Snorlax package, kind of non-negotiable. 4 Research and 4 Pokeballs. Again, I can't see any list that changes that. And I'll leave it there. If you made it this far, please consider subscribing to the channel. It's a new channel. I'm trying my best on these videos and trying to get quite a few out there, especially if you like kind of non-meta, more interesting decks like this that you still take into the high ranks or even potentially into tournaments and show the matches, talk through every card choice in an efficient, hopefully well-edited video format. then do please subscribing to the channel. And even more importantly than that, let me know what you think of this type of video format. Let me know any ways I can improve the video from here. And definitely let me know if you think there's any potential better Rayquaza deck. I'll be pretty interested. All right, see you in the next video.